is on!
If I'm being honest, I'd bet big money that Cyclops and Havok are among the most misinterpreted siblings in Marvel Comics. I mean, just look at them. They're both members of the Summers family, and they both unleash massive energy attacks. If all you saw of them was a panel or two, they might appear to have essentially the same mutation, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I used to think the only major difference between the two was that Cyclops shot red beams while Havok fired waves of plasma. But once you start breaking down what actually causes their powers, you realize that Marvel has built two very different energy systems that simply look similar from a distance. There's even a strange interaction that generally makes the brothers resistant to one another's powers. In certain stories, one brother's energy has even charged the other up instead of hurting them. So what exactly is going on here? Why is one brother forced to wear a visor while the other eventually develops much better control? Today, we'll be discussing the biggest differences between Havok and Cyclops' powers, from how their energy is generated to how their attacks behave, and most strangely of all, why the two brothers can usually withstand each other's blasts. I think most of the confusion surrounding Cyclops and Havok begins with the fact that they look kinda similar. They both release enormous bursts of energy, and it's easy to glance at them and think the only difference between them is the color. But when you start reading the comics, it becomes clear that that's not the case at all. Let's start with Cyclops, whose powers are famously complicated. If you've ever spent any time on a comic book forum, I'm sorry for you, but you've probably encountered the term punch dimension at some point. Throughout the years, Marvel has offered more than one explanation for where Scott's energy actually comes from. Some handbook descriptions say that his body absorbs ambient energy and that his eyes act as apertures to another dimension filled with enormous concussive force. You know, the aforementioned punch dimension. Other descriptions focus more simply on his ability to project powerful concussive energy from his eyes. The one consistent point is that Cyclops' optic blasts aren't ordinary lasers or heat vision. They strike with physical force. Havok's power is more straightforward. He functions like a biological battery that constantly absorbs ambient cosmic energy, including starlight, X-rays, and even gamma radiation. His body metabolizes that energy and releases it as waves of plasma. That distinction makes all the difference. Cyclops is usually described as releasing concussive force through his eyes, while Alex absorbs cosmic radiation into his body and converts it into plasma. That alone gives us a reason to not reduce them to brothers with the same power. Since we've established where the powers come from, it's natural to ask what the blasts actually do when they hit something. This is another area where Scott and Alex seem similar until you scratch the surface and realize that their attacks operate differently. Cyclops' optic blasts are often mistaken for lasers, but they're not technically lasers. One of the defining aspects of Scott's mutation is that his attacks are based on concussive force, like enormous invisible punches. That's why his optic blasts can smash through solid rock, send a giant robot flying, or shatter a wall without melting everything around it. His blasts hit with tremendous kinetic force. In the past, artists have occasionally drawn the beams with sparks, smoke, or a bright glow, but the blast itself is generally described as heatless, concussive energy, not lasers. Alex's attacks, meanwhile, are waves of plasma energy. They can generate intense heat, but it would be misleading to say that they only burn. Havok's plasma can disintegrate or vaporize certain materials, but it can also create powerful concussive effects by violently disrupting the air and matter around its target. His attacks can blast objects apart instead of simply cooking them. I think the easiest way to understand this distinction is this. Scott's mutation primarily strikes through concussive force, while Alex's combines plasma energy, heat, and destructive impact. To an untrained eye, the results may appear similar, but the processes behind them are fundamentally different. That's also one reason it's so difficult to decide which brother is stronger. They're not using the same weapon. Out of everything weird that happens during the Summers brothers' lives, one of the most frequently asked questions is why don't they just destroy each other whenever they clash, with Cyclops firing concussive energy and Havok releasing superheated plasma. Marvel's traditional explanation is that the brothers each possess a unique resistance to each other's energy. Their bodies can metabolize or absorb the other brother's power in a way that prevents it from affecting them normally. Simply put, Scott's body recognizes and processes Alex's energy differently from an ordinary attack, and Alex's body does the same with Scott's optic blasts. That's why Cyclops is usually unharmed by Havok's plasma, and vice versa. It's one of the strangest forms of genetic courtesy in the comics, and it only drives their rivalry further. However, don't think that this means their attacks always cancel each other out. This interaction actually varies occasionally depending on the story. During Inferno, for example, Havok didn't fire directly into Cyclops' optic beams and merge the two attacks. Instead, he repeatedly blasted Cyclops, and Scott's body absorbed the energy rather than being injured by it. That additional power allowed Cyc to unleash a far more powerful optic blast against Mr. Sinister. This is an important distinction. Their powers don't follow one universal rule in which the beams always cancel each other out. Most of the time, the brothers are simply resistant to each other's attacks. Under certain circumstances, one brother's power can actually charge the other. That's much more interesting than simple immunity, and it helps explain why fans still argue about how these abilities should interact. You've probably wondered why Cyclops is rarely seen without his visor. It's not just there to make him look cool, although it is undeniably one of the greatest superhero accessories ever designed. Scott normally can't safely open his eyes without releasing his optic blasts. The traditional explanation for this is a head injury Scott suffered as a child after he and Alex jumped from their parents' damaged aircraft. That injury, combined with a psychological block, left Scott unable to consciously shut off his optic blasts. Without ruby quartz lenses covering his eyes, the beams are released continuously and can cause immense, unintended destruction. The visor isn't the source of Scott's power, it's a control mechanism that allows him to contain, aim, and regulate the size and intensity of his blasts. The situation is different for Scott's younger brother. When Alex's mutation activated, his primary problem was releasing the enormous amount of energy accumulating inside his body. His plasma could radiate outwards in uncontrolled waves. Therefore, he wore specially designed containment costumes that helped him monitor and regulate his power. Over the years, Alex has become much better at consciously directing his plasma. However, it would be wrong to say that he permanently outgrew the need for technological assistance. Havok's specialized costumes continue to contain sensors that measure and help control his energy output. The concentric circles on his chest have even been used to indicate how much energy he's storing. So both brothers use technology, but for different reasons. Scott's visor prevents a continuous blast from escaping his eyes. Alex's costume helps him monitor, contain, and direct energy radiating throughout his body. If I had to describe both of their fighting styles in one sentence, I'd say Scott's a sniper and Alex is an artillery strike. Even though they both project energy, their powers leave their bodies in very different ways. Scott's blasts are extremely precise. He can fire a concentrated beam at a specific target and adjust its width and intensity through his visor. Scott has also spent years learning how to ricochet his optic blasts off of reflective surfaces to strike opponents hiding behind cover or positioned at difficult angles. That's actually one of my favorite aspects of the character. Cyclops doesn't simply point his face at something and fire, he can calculate angles and rebounds in the middle of combat before releasing a blast. Havok's plasma naturally behaves differently. When Alex doesn't consciously control it, the energy radiates outwards from his body in concentric waves, similar to ripples spreading across a pond. However, it would be incorrect to say that Havok cannot direct his power or strike a distant individual target. He can deliberately channel his plasma in a single direction, usually along the length of his arms, and fire focused blasts. The difference is that maintaining this kind of directional output requires concentration and can become physically exhausting. Cyclops' mutation naturally lends itself to precision, while Havok's naturally lends itself to widespread destruction, although he can focus it with effort. This isn't an accident, it complements their personalities perfectly. Scott is the disciplined sharpshooter, while Alex is the devastating artillery strike. Neither approach is automatically better, they're simply suited to different kinds of battle. This is something even I didn't truly grasp until I compared the two brothers side by side. A more powerful-looking attack doesn't mean that the person using it can continue attacking forever. When it comes to endurance, the brothers deal with different limitations. Havok's body absorbs and stores ambient cosmic energy before releasing it as plasma. Every major attack uses a portion of that stored energy. If Alex spends all of his available energy, he needs time to recharge. Classic handbook descriptions have estimated that a complete recharge under ordinary conditions takes roughly 17 hours. although exposure to a powerful source of cosmic radiation can accelerate this process. That means Havok's strongest attacks come from a finite reserve. Cyclops also absorbs and processes ambient energy, depending on which explanation of his mutation a story follows. Heavy use can deplete his available optic energy and temporarily weaken or even prevent him from firing an effective blast. So it would be wrong to claim that Scott has unlimited endurance or that his power isn't resource-based at all. The difference is how their energy is stored and released. Havok is much more explicitly portrayed as a cosmic battery whose output depends on the charge contained within his cells. Cyclops tends to replenish his energy passively, but even he can exhaust his reserves through extreme use. Again, this doesn't automatically make one brother superior. Havok can release enormous amounts of stored energy in devastating attacks. Cyclops generally excels at sustained, disciplined barrages and carefully controlled shots. Raw power isn't always enough to defeat the person who manages his resources more effectively. One of Havok's most underused abilities comes from the fact that everyone is so focused on his plasma blasts, they forget he has another trick Cyclops cannot naturally duplicate. Havok can use his stored energy to propel himself. By directing his plasma downwards, Alex can create thrust and lift his body into the air. Depending on his energy reserves and the story, this can function as genuine powered flight or controlled aerial propulsion. Now, Cyclops has some superficially similar feats with the recoil from his optic blasts. He's fired at the ground to slow a fall, he's pushed himself backwards or altered his momentum during combat, and that's a clever use of force, but it's not the same thing as sustained flight. Once Scott stops firing, the thrust ends. Havok can continue to direct stored energy beneath himself to remain airborne. That matters because flight changes the entire battlefield. Alex can attack from angles Scott just can't naturally reach, he can reposition himself more quickly, and he remains out of range of certain close combat opponents. Again, this doesn't necessarily make Havok the better fighter. Cyclops has decades of tactical experience that compensates for his lack of natural flight. But if we're comparing only their powers, this is one clear advantage in Havok's arsenal. I didn't fully understand this aspect of Havok until I started looking at his biggest moments in the comics. Most people think of his mutation as a straightforward ranged attack. He absorbs cosmic energy, stores it, and blasts it out as plasma. But that energy doesn't have to be released immediately. Havok can hold enormous amounts of radiation inside his body, process it, and use that charge to amplify his overall energy output and resistance. However, we should be careful here because Havok doesn't have a clearly established general-purpose ability that allows him to convert plasma into ordinary superhuman muscle strength whenever he wants. The best example comes from his battle with the Forgotten Summers brother, Gabriel Summers, also known as Vulcan. Vulcan blasted Havok into a star where Alex absorbed an extraordinary amount of stellar energy. When Havok returned, he was supercharged and used that stored energy to unleash attacks powerful enough to challenge Vulcan. The important point is not that Havok turned that energy into a conventional strength boost, it's that his mutation allowed him to survive, absorb, and redirect an extreme source of cosmic power. That's incredibly impressive. Cyclops doesn't normally demonstrate that level of energy absorption. Scott is a brilliant tactician, leader, and fighter, but his mutation is primarily focused on projecting optic force rather than absorbing stellar energy and returning it against an opponent. This is another reason the brothers are difficult to compare. Scott is the more consistent precision fighter, while Alex can reach extraordinary levels when exposed to the right energy source. Now, this next point is less about the brothers' power and more about their history. Havok has been manipulated, possessed, and had his memories altered in several stories. Eric the Red manipulated events around Alex, and Psylocke once erased his memories of encountering the X-Men on Storm's orders. But those aren't the same thing. Psylocke didn't seize permanent control of Havok and turn him into a puppet in that particular instant, she just altered his memories. It would also be misleading to claim that Alex is biologically easier to control than Scott. Plenty of powerful Marvel characters, including Cyclops, have been mentally manipulated, possessed, or deceived. Scott has spent a lot of time around some of the world's most powerful telepaths, including Professor X, Jean Grey, Emma Frost, and Psylocke. That experience may make him more familiar with telepathic threats, however, experience isn't the same thing as immunity. Cyclops is not naturally protected from telepathy, and Havok hasn't been officially established as possessing an unusually weak mind. So this is better understood as a difference in their personal histories and training, rather than a direct difference between their mutations. Also, from what we've established so far, Havok's body functions like a living cosmic battery, constantly absorbing power from the environment. What people sometimes fail to appreciate is that this process also grants him extraordinary resistance to the forms of energy his body is built to absorb. Havok has immense resistance to cosmic radiation, gamma radiation, and other forms of ambient energy. He can also endure extreme heat when that heat is connected to an energy source his mutation can process. That's a pretty big advantage. The greatest example is, once again, that time Vulcan blasted Alex into a star. Instead of being immediately destroyed, Havok absorbed an enormous amount of stellar energy and returned supercharged. However, the script shouldn't claim that he was completely unharmed. Surviving the event and converting the star's energy into power doesn't mean that the experience had no physical effect on him, and it would also be pure speculation to state with certainty that Cyclops would instantly die in the same situation. The comics haven't presented a direct comparison in which both brothers are thrown into identical stellar conditions. What we can safely say is that Havok's mutation gives him a level of cosmic energy absorption and radiation resistance that Cyclops doesn't normally possess. Cyclops is built for projection, accuracy, and concussive force. Havok, meanwhile, is built to absorb and process forms of radiation that would destroy most living beings. Now that we've covered the major characteristics of their powers, I think the best way to compare Cyclops and Havok is through what they've actually accomplished. Comic book Feats can tell us more than a simple power description ever could. We've already mentioned Havok getting blasted into a star, and that's maybe his biggest feat ever. Instead of being obliterated by the heat and radiation, his mutation absorbed an incredible amount of stellar energy. He later returned with his plasma output dramatically amplified and used that energy against Vulcan, one of Marvel's most powerful energy manipulators. That feat demonstrates just how high Havok's upper limit can be when he has access to an extraordinary power source. Cyclops impresses in a completely different way. Scott doesn't need to survive inside a star to prove he's dangerous. Time and again, he's defeated opponents who appear stronger than him by using his blasts with extraordinary accuracy. He can vary their intensity, calculate ricochets, destroy key structural points, and use precisely timed attacks to exploit an opponent's weakness. So, who's more powerful? If we're measuring the highest demonstrated energy output under extraordinary circumstances, Havok has a serious case. If we're measuring consistency, control, battlefield awareness, and the ability to use every blast effectively, Cyclops has an equally strong argument. That's why fans have debated this one for decades. Another thing I didn't fully appreciate until I compared these guys side by side was how their powers reflect the kind of leaders they became. Scott is one of the X-Men's most experienced strategists. He rarely enters a fight without assessing the battlefield, calculating probable outcomes, and deciding where each member of his team should be. His eyes never leave the field as he searches for the best angle for an optic blast. Sometimes he's not even trying to knock an opponent out, he's creating space, separating groups, breaking through obstacles, or forcing enemies towards a particular position. Watching Cyclops fight feels like watching someone play speed chess. Havok is a different story and a different kind of combatant, but that doesn't mean he's incapable of leadership. Alex has successfully led teams like X-Factor, the Starjammers, and even the Uncanny Avengers. He's also described as an instinctive tactician and strategist. However, his mutation naturally encourages a broader and more explosive approach to battle. His energy radiates over a wider area, and his attacks often overwhelm or saturate the battlefield rather than striking with Scott's extreme precision. There's not much difference between the two when it comes to courage or willingness to lead. Both brothers have been pushed into impossible situations and forced to command teams against overwhelming odds. The difference is that their powers encourage different methods. Scott's mutation rewards discipline and exact placement. Alex's rewards energy management, adaptability, and explosive force. All of this information raises one obvious question, though. If Scott and Alex are normally resistant to each other's energy, how could either brother defeat the other? The answer is simple. Neither man can rely entirely on their mutation. Their powers generally have a reduced effect on each other, so a confrontation between them comes down to tactics, movement, and especially hand-to-hand combat. Something a lot of fans aren't aware of is that Wolverine trained Havok in martial arts. Alex, therefore, has far more close-quarters combat experience than some people assume. He can hold his own when his plasma fails. Scott has also spent years training alongside the X-Men. As one of the team's longest-serving leaders, Scott has learned how to fight when his optic blasts are unavailable, ineffective, or just too dangerous to use. Their powers don't literally negate or cancel each other every time they clash. The brothers are simply highly resistant to each other's energy, which reduces the value of relying on a direct hit. That makes a fight between them more interesting. Instead of becoming a contest over who can fire the larger beam, it turns into a battle of strategy, positioning, and physical skill. And that's exactly where Cyclops' experience and Havok's often underrated combat training become critical. The one theme that stands out across both brothers' stories is control. What makes it interesting is that Scott and Alex have dealt with very different versions of that problem. Cyclops generally can't safely turn off his optic blasts by choice. The traditional explanation combines the head injury he suffered as a child with a psychological block that prevents him from consciously closing the flow of energy. That's where the ruby quartz visor comes into the equation. It's not a style statement or an indicator that his power level is fluctuating. It's an essential tool that allows him to open his eyes without destroying everything in front of him. There have been periods where Scott temporarily gained control over his powers, but his normal condition requires ruby quartz protection. Havok's problem began in the opposite way. His body absorbed cosmic energy and released it in dangerous waves that he struggled to direct. His containment suits helped him monitor his charge and prevent uncontrolled plasma from radiating into the environment. Over time, Alex learned to consciously focus his energy far more effectively. However, his costume still contains technology that measures and assists with controlling his output. He has not simply outgrown every need for technological support. So, Scott's challenge is preventing energy from constantly escaping through his eyes. Alex's challenge is managing the amount of cosmic energy stored throughout his body and deciding how it will be released. Both brothers struggle with control, but their problems come from completely different mechanisms. So, that's that. We've gone through the most important differences, which leaves us with the one question everybody wants the answer to. Between Cyclops and Havok, who's really stronger? To be honest, I don't think this argument will ever have one permanent answer. If we're measuring raw energy absorption and maximum destructive potential under extraordinary circumstances, I completely understand why people place Havok above Cyclops. Surviving inside a star, absorbing its energy, and returning powerful enough to challenge Vulcan is an incredible feat. It demonstrates that Havok's upper limits are almost impossible to calculate when he has access to a massive cosmic power source. Then there's Cyclops. Scott doesn't need the largest explosion to prove that he's in control. His power works best through precision, consistency, and strategy. More than once, Cyclops has outmaneuvered foes who were far more powerful on paper simply because he understood exactly how and when to use his blasts. That's one reason he continues to be chosen as the X-Men's leader. The debate ultimately comes down to what you value most. If you're focused on maximum energy absorption and explosive output, Havok has the stronger argument. If you value control, strategy, reliability, and making every blast count, Cyclops takes the win. As for me, well, I doubt Marvel wants there to be a conclusive answer. Each generation gives the Summers brothers new and impressive feats that move the argument in different directions. Perhaps that's what keeps this rivalry so interesting. Taking everything into account, this was never really a story about one brother plainly outmatching the other. The real point is that two mutants with visually similar energy powers possess completely different mutations with different sources, behaviors, advantages, and limitations. The coolest part for me, though, is the way these abilities interact. Their attacks don't simply cancel each other out or tear straight through the other brother. Scott and Alex are normally resistant to each other's energy, and under unusual circumstances, one brother's powers can even charge the other. That means many confrontations between them come down to strategy, technique, and experience rather than raw power. I don't see a world where Marvel permanently decides who wins, and that's exactly why this debate is so much fun. But now that we have a better grasp of what's actually happening, I'd love to know which brother you'd choose to have in your corner. Let us know in the comments section down below.